The Pixel 9 Pro, Pro XL have one fatal flaw. And it's not even fatal. It's just the only real thing that people can point at it and say this phone is not good enough. And that's the chip. That's the benchmarks and the power. And I don't really put a lot of thought into it. I think that the Tensor 4 is a fantastic chip, just over 3 gigahertz, plenty of power, plenty of everything. And it's funny to me because people are like, oh, it doesn't have the benchmarks, it doesn't have the power. But yet the phone's cameras and AI capabilities like kick the butt of a lot of these phones that have more power, right? So it doesn't always come down to that stuff. And that's one reason why I really don't put a lot of emphasis on it. But with the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, there's just such a giant leap to the next level that it's really going to add more fodder to the argument of what is the plan for Google here. And this is a 2024 phone. We're in 2025. The 2025 phones are starting to roll out. The new chip, Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, and it's quick. It's got so much power. I mean, the chip can go up to over 4.3 gigahertz. This one, barely 3, just over 3. And then if you take a look at the benchmarks, I will acknowledge this, the benchmarks are compatible with maybe somewhere between a 8 Gen 1 and like a 8 plus Gen 1. But that's not really a problem for me. And I don't think that's a problem for most of creation because that allows you to play high-level games reasonably well. It gives you pretty decent processing. It's a customized chip. It's got a lot of emphasis on AI. Of course, on the back end, you also have Google servers, their AI models, and all that stuff. And they're leading by huge margins in that department. And then all the great stuff with the image signal processor, computational photography, and really it just feels and looks and acts like a flagship phone. And just for your personal edification, a little explanation moment, the flagship phone just means it's the best one that they have. That's what it means. It comes back from the old terminology from the ships back in the day, back when, old Navy days. I'm sure they still use that terminology now, but that's where it came from. The flagship was the one with all the big flags on it, the best and brightest one they put out in front to showcase and all that good stuff. It was the star of the fleet. That's what this is. And when you take a look at previous Pixel phones, you take a look at the Pixel lineup, the Pixel 9 Pro, Pro XL is the flagship phone. So people are like, oh, it's not a flagship phone. Well, it is. It is very much a flagship phone. Is it a Samsung phone? No. Is it an iPhone? No. But then you take a look at all that Apple has with the A18 Bionic and how powerful it is. And it's okay, cool. There's like 4 console level games you can play that were remade. They're not even new ones. And it's got bugs galore, heating issues, all sorts of other things. So pick and choose what you want, folks. I mean, moral of the story is, for everything you can complain about with the benchmarks on here, you can complain about the camera on the S24. You can complain about the iOS bugs and the lack of Apple intelligence and how sucky it is over on Apple. You can complain about every platform. So use what you want, enjoy it, don't listen to other folks. But I do think they do need to step it up a little bit, right? So as we move into the G5, I think there's a lot of expectations with the Tensor G5 because it's being made by TSMC. The best of the best of the best when it comes to making smartphone chips. They make chips for a lot of folks. They make Apple's chips, they make Qualcomm chips, and now they're going to make Google's chips. So Google has gone back into the lab and designed this chip in coordination, I guess, with TSMC. They tell them what they want. They look at what they have to offer. They build it to their specs. And then bam, Bob's your uncle. We got the new chip. And it's probably not going to be that fast. So all the stuff I'm seeing preliminarily, especially looking at this, I know we're in the early stages. I know I talk about, I don't like to put too much weight into rumors and things like that. I don't expect to see a Tensor 5 with the 4 gigahertz power plant. I just don't. I don't expect to see 3 million Antutu score. But I do expect to see measured progress, but it's still going to end up in the same position where folks are like, oh, well, the A18, the A19, the Snapdragon 8 Elite, they blow it out of the water. Shoot, I just saw some articles the other day where people are trashing and saying, oh, the 8 Elite blows it was the Nubia Z70 Ultra. So they were like, oh, it blows the Snapdragon 8 Generation 3 out of the water. It kills the benchmarks. Look, benchmarks really are not that helpful. It's just a thing where they run it out at max and see how it performs. That's not something that's really tailored and shows you what apps actually do. And people that buy into this benchmark BS, if you remember, the Snapdragon 8 Generation 1. Yes, 8 Generation 1. What's the one? Yes, the one was very, very, very hot chipset, right? and it had problems with battery, it had problems with thermals, it had problems like, that's why they came out with the 8 Plus generation one very quickly after that and put it in the Z Fold. So if you remember back to Benchmark Gate, and over the guys over at Geekbench were testing the S22 Ultra back then, and they found out that the game optimization service software that was on there was throttling basically everything meaningful on the phone, to where even like apps like Twitter and other meaningful apps people use were being throttled so heavily that the phone was using as much power and running at the same performance level for these apps as a Snapdragon. Which one was it? The one that was in the Pixel 5, the 765, I think. I think the 765. I'm drawing a blank. It's been a long time since I thought about this, but it was running basically the same as the Pixel 5. So if you want to talk about benchmark stuff, well, what are you actually running stuff at, right? So your phone is never running at 100% doing any of this stuff. Now, benchmarks are an indicator of performance. They're an indicator of how well something will perform and run, but it doesn't matter if your Antutu score is 750,000 or 3 million, Twitter's going to load just the same. Your camera app's going to load just the same. Most things you do on a day-to-day basis will be indistinguishable in the eyes of benchmarks because it doesn't need the power, it doesn't apply the power, and it doesn't designate that power on demand to run those things. So you can look at it all day long and say, oh, it's got a 3 million score. You're never going to hit that. Even if you're one of those people that sits there and opens the apps and closes them 5 million times over and over and over and over to do your speed test, you'll never hit half that. That's just not how benchmarks work. It's like, I like to kind of liken it to cars. Phones are kind of like cars. And you look at the engine in a car and you look at the capabilities of a turbo, is it supercharged, you got a cold air intake, whatever. We look at horsepower. Horsepower is usually a good indicator for how much power you have available, but what is it encumbered by? Or encumbered by, rather. You could put a 5.0 from a Ford Mustang inside of a Challenger or a Charger, and it would not perform the same way that it does in the Mustang because the Mustang is smaller and lighter. The Dodge Chrysler vehicles are particularly heavy. The way they made them, they are heavy vehicles, so they have to have a crap ton of more horsepower to try and keep up and move at the same pace. So you can't put a chipset inside of a phone and then have it in 4 different phones. It does not work the same way. If you go look at these benchmarks and you look at the Snapdragon 8 Generation 3, 8 Generation 2, 8 Elite, and you put it in the Nubia, you put it in the Samsung, you put it in an Honor, the benchmarks are going to be slightly different on every single one of them. A lot of that has to do with optimization, how they include the other hardware in there, how it's built, heat dissipation. There's like a lot of things that play into this. So it's nothing you should get wrapped around the axle about. And my experience with the Pixel 9 Pro, Pro XL is fantastic. It runs everything better than my iPhone. My iPhone, I had to reset it today because everything was being janky. I had serious lag whenever I was typing. It's just not been good. So you can look at a lot of things, and it's just one little snapshot. Like, regardless of how the Snapdragon 8 Generation 3 performed, it's still getting its butt kicked in several different areas, particularly the camera department, by the Pixel, which has way less benchmarks, right? It even beats the iPhone. And the iPhone benchmarks surely beat the pants off of the Google. So I think that Google's done a good job sticking to their strategy. I think there were some limfacts, for civilian terminology, limiting factors that were... Sorry, that's not civilian terminology. That's military terminology, just telling you as civilians. Limfacts when it came to how they were able to incorporate their vision into the Tensor chips, because the underlying chips that Samsung made just are not as good as TSMC. So with TSMC, I expect to see more efficiency. I expect to see less heat issues, which I haven't really experienced those with the Tensor 4. I think they did a fantastic job with the Tensor 4. It's a very good chip. And had the Tensor 4 quality chip come out a year or two previously, I think it really would have set a good path for the Pixel phones. But the Pixel phones are doing great right now. People are buying them. I'm seeing them more places. Their market share is kicking up. And largely, they're doing a pretty darn good job. So Google, their CEOs come out and said, look, we're not trying to compete in the benchmarks. We're not trying to hit a 5 gigahertz speed on a phone. Like, you don't need that. It's not going to do anything. It's just not. So until we have these applications and we have these things that actually push the envelope for this stuff, yeah, it's going to be a little while, I think, before we get there with the tensors, but I expect probably a 15-20% bump when the G5 gets here. And hey, if they get to a 3.4, 3.5 gigahertz processor, I don't hear anyone really complaining about, nobody really complains about the power. When you take a look at the Snapdragon 8 Generation 2, 8 Generation 3, nobody complains about the power. What do they complain about? Heat, battery life, screen issues, modems, all those different things. Nobody really cares about benchmarks. The only time it's really applicable is whenever it's like a Corvette pulls up next to a, I don't know, a GTR, right? The GTR, of course, are going to flex on the Corvette. But I mean, it's one of those things where it's a showy thing that looks fancy and shiny, and it makes people think that they're more competitive than they actually are. But in real world terminology and in the practical world that we live in, it just really isn't that much of a factor. Sure, is it an indicator? Yes. Is having a 3.6 gigahertz processor with better hardware-based ray tracing going to matter? Yeah, it is. Is better thermal management going to matter? Yeah, it is. Because if you don't have good thermals, you can have all the power in the world, and whenever it peaks out in 10 minutes and your frames drop to poop, the other phone that's got better heat management and better performance, staying steady at 75 frames, is, yeah, it's not 80, but it's not going to drop down to 50. So there's just a lot of stuff that goes into it. Do I think that they need to throw a little bit of a bone out there, try maybe squeeze a little bit more juice out of it as we go to the G5, the G6? Sure. But I think they're on the right path right now, and I think that the market response and the response from people has been really good. It's funny too, because I think the consumer expectation is a little bit lower than those of us who get twisted up around this and get our shorts in a knot. Most people are perfectly fine with an iPhone 16 that they pay $829 for and doesn't have 3 cameras and has slow charging and has a 60 hertz screen, and they're perfectly happy with that. And then there's those of us who are like, no, it's got to have 120 hertz, 140 hertz. It's got to have 3 million and 2.2 score. It's got to have this. It's got to. And I think mostly whenever these companies are making things, they're designing them for more people who are a little bit more pedestrian than probably me or a lot of folks watching this video. But anyway, the Pixel, great phone. I'm liking where they're headed. I'm curious to see what we get the G5. Again, I think it's probably going to be about a 15-20% bump in performance. Maybe we'll get to about 3.35 gigahertz. I'm fine with that. I mean, even if they hit, I don't even keep up with the N22 scores. I really don't. I think 2 million's good, or over that's supposed to be really good. But yeah, as long as it shows incremental progress, it shows that they're changing, it shows that they're putting better components, getting better GPUs in there. I would like to see better UFS. I'd like to see them get the faster storage in there. I'd like to see a 256 baseline introductory storage with the Pro models. Those are more practical things I'd like to see. And hopefully we'll get that soon. But anyway, that's all I got. If you have any questions, comments, gripes, concerns, complaints, I know you do. So go to the comment section. We'll talk about it. If you enjoyed the video, if you found this helpful, if you love Pixel videos, this is the place. Hit the like and the subscribe button and the little notification bell if you want updates when new videos come out. And as always, thanks for being here. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you guys next time.